welcome to the Cinematologist Podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me, as always, I'm delighted to say, is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario. How are you?
Hello, Neil. I'm okay, actually. I've had a cold all week. I picked up some strain of illness in Sunderland, coming back from the conference. So I was on a overly crowded train with a combination of Sunderland supporters who were happy because they'd won, and drunk revelers because it was Halloween, and obviously picked something up. So I was really bad through the week with my voice and not sleeping and stuff, but it's getting better. But if anybody thinks I'm affecting a very deep booming voice, I'm doing my Orson Welles impression. You know, my name is Orson Welles. I wrote and directed this picture, and I might keep doing that for the rest of my life.
Do it. Yeah, I was going to say it sounded like you caught Barry White-itis on the train.
Let's get this podcast on.
Well, I mean, it's actually a good segue into today's episode, really, which is very much about voice. And one of the notes I made, which is something I've thought about quite a lot when listening to our guest on their own film podcast, is what a great voice that they have. So, Dario, tell us what we're in for today.
Yeah, so I spoke to Rico Gagliano, who is the producer, writer, host, and I think editor as well of the Mubi Podcast. And we do have other film podcasters on from time to time, and only the ones I think that we admire and like. And I've admired the Mubi Podcast since it came out for various reasons, which you'll hear on the interview. But I'm now glad. I'm glad to say that I like Rico now that I've actually spoken to him. So it's kind of like a double plus good, as it were. Yeah, I mean, the Mubi Podcast, I think I just love the rigor and the depth of the research, the structure of the narrativization, the editing, this sort of film audio documentary style is really sort of embedded in a sense of place and time through the sound design. We discuss a little bit of his background, his cinephilic origin story, becoming a critic, moving over from radio to podcasting, and then moving on to Mubi. Obviously, the process of making the podcast, and we talk about various series and episodes. And like you say, he's got one of those smooth NPR voices that is really easy to listen to, and it kind of makes me want to affect some kind of voice, as I've just discussed before. But I think there's a lot in this for film people and for podcast people alike.
Yeah, agree. I wondered, listening to it, I wonder if he has, if it's a sorry to bother you kind of thing, where his real voice is something very different and he can just switch into Rico the podcaster. But I'm sure it's authentic. I mean, yeah, it's a really fantastic conversation. I was sorry to miss it. I was hoping to be part of it, but the storms that battered this week just made my internet, which is tentative at the best of times. But to listen to it as a listener, I thought was really enjoyable, and I've got a lot to draw out. And so I think maybe we should just get into that now.
Actually, I took my very first film studies class. It was an amazing, just drop into the kind of art house world. I came to film school. I remember in the late 80s going. My idea of an art film was like Repo Man and Something Wild.
Yeah,
because they were kind of punky aesthetic.
Yeah,
great movies, by the way. I still stand by them, but hardly the most difficult film. And it was because I was a freshman applying late for my classes, the first film studies class that I could do to get into was called International Cinemas.
Wow.
New International Cinemas, new in quotes. But it was like French New Wave. There was a survey of New Wave cinemas.
Gotcha.
So it was like French New Wave, German New Wave, Brazilian New Wave, and Japanese New Wave. So it was kind of like, I remember that.
Sounds great.
Today I would be like, great, I get to do that for my job for a while. That sounds awesome. But I just remember my first day was fine because I started, it was French New Wave. So they started by playing Detour. which is a totally entertaining noir, of course.
Yeah.
And to give you an idea of the kind of bedrock of the French New Wave, like what they were building off of. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be cool. And then like breathless, I was like, what the hell is going on? What are you doing to me? I don't understand. And then I got it.
Would that kind of stuff then, I mean, because it's interesting, Neil and I, we talk a lot about our respective narratives, our influences as young people, and then how you, at our age now, define that story about how you become a film person. I mean, and it sounds there as well that you came to university and then discovered kind of like art house in that sense, because that's kind of similar to me rather than getting younger. But I don't know, have you got a kind of origin story of, you know, Rico, the young film buff kind of thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, like everybody has their film buff story. I mean, it starts, and it's probably not dissimilar from bazillions of people in our field. It's like, you know, Star Wars, all of those kind of easy things. I had the benefit of having a much older father, so he was actually watching a lot of older films. So I did see classics like Citizen Kane when I was still in high school. I'm like maybe even younger than high school, might have been in school, and all that kind of stuff. But I originally got into, you know, just big blockbuster science fiction.
Oh, right, okay.
Kind of stuff. Like it was instantaneous. Star Wars made me instantaneously a film buff, and really made me like. I saw that movie. I think that movie actually was a good movie to get people into being cinephiles, because you wanted to watch it over and over again, which made you start to pay attention to all the little details of it, and also how it was made. Like, how was it doing this to me that I want to keep going back and seeing it? So actually, and it was the first movie that I remember. I mean, I'm sure this had happened before, but it was the first movie I remember there were lots of things in the media about how it was made, like how they did the special effects. Probably 2001 had the same thing going on before I was born, but
sure,
it was the first in my memory where it was like, how did they make those special effects happen? How did they do the lightsaber? What was the background of where this movie came from in George Lucas's mind, which also then takes you backwards into film history, because he was drawing on Westerns, space operas of the past and stuff. So it's actually like a pretty good way to realize that there's a lot going on in any movie, I guess. Although I'm not sure I processed it that way. I also really got into film criticism because I wanted to read anything that I could about that movie.
Right.
So I remember read any of the books that came out about it. There were also books about the making of Star Wars and where it came from. And there was the novelization.
I remember the annuals and the sort of, the popular culture stuff that came out around that. And it really sort of, I think maybe for the first time in a mainstream film, fed into the idea that there was a culture around cinema or around a movie for sort of our adolescent generation, I suppose, growing up at that time.
Absolutely. By the way, it's also interesting. I was so into that movie. Even though everybody was into that movie, I was so into it that I was an ostracized geek about it. Like, I just couldn't stop talking about it, or like pretending Star Wars on the playground.
Right. Oh, God, it's the Star Wars guy. Get him to shut up.
Exactly. Also gave me the hint of like, you can get into things enough that the real world will kind of go, that's too much. You might want to find some other people like you to talk about this. But,
right.
But then from there, I remember just getting into it didn't even have to be good. I mean, it was like late 70s feels like as much as we sort of enjoy a lot of it now, in a lot of ways, it feels like a dismal time. I remember seeing the movie Meteor. Do you remember that film?
Yeah, I do remember Meteor. Yeah.
Really?
Or Concorde 77 and stuff like that. Yeah. All the disaster films from the late 70s. Yeah, I remember them well.
I would not be the first to like identify them by saying that the movie posters for all of them had pictures of all of the huge stars that were in it along the bottom of the poster.
Yeah.
Maybe to distract from the fact that the movie was going to suck and that the concept was ridiculous. But Meteor was about a meteor that was going to destroy Earth. And I remember even at that age going in and thinking, this isn't probably that great, but I'm going to watch it anyway because it's a movie with space in it.
Sure. And it had the Deton feel, didn't it, as well? Because it was the Russians and the Americans getting together kind of thing to blow up this, that Deep Impact it was, basically.
Was it? I don't remember a thing of it. I have not seen it since.
So I'm sadder than you, really. I remember the plot,
Wow, now you're a film geek. No, but I just remember the shot of the meteor, which looked, even then, it was like, this is a rock that they have filmed, and there's like superimposed the Earth in the background as it wobbles towards it. But so I would see all those things. I remember seeing Xanadu and liking it, unabashedly. Like now I can like it ironically. Like there was wonderful things about Xanadu. The music is actually really wonderful and everything, but it is actually a pretty poor movie. But I remember just like loving it anyway because it had like roller skating in it. Anyway, but like all that kind of stuff. And then my dad getting me into, older movies. As I said, I remember seeing, I think, All About Eve early on and Sunset Boulevard pretty early on, maybe even in middle school, possibly early high school. But then it was like Steven Spielberg movies, for sure, were the thing. I got into all of those. And I remember E.T. especially. There was a moment, I think, in every film geek's life where you want to be a filmmaker. And it was more than a moment for me. I went to college thinking that I would still be one, not realizing that I'm just not cut out for the job. And I saw all these, but I remember that was the first time when the director was like, Steven Spielberg was on the cover of Time magazine. For Star Wars, it was still like a picture of Darth Vader or of a C-3PO and R2-D2, but it was like on Time magazine, there was Steven Spielberg with E.T.'s head over him. And I remember getting really interested in that and being like, oh, so like you could be a big, like a celebrity making these things too. That like seemed enticing to me. But anyway, his movies were just, of course, just the greatest. I saw all of this. E.T. a million times, Poltergeist, Toby Hooper, obviously, but everybody kind of intimates that Spielberg had his hands in it. And then this is now the younger folk in our audience. Well, the younger folk, the younger middle-aged folk in our audience are going to take me to task for this. But it was The Goonies. I remember seeing it because, again, Spielberg produced it, and I would see anything with his name on it. And I remember at the time being just old enough. This is now I'm in high school. And I remember like middle high school, probably like, I don't know, 10th grade, something like that. And watching it and thinking, I think I may be too old for this. I feel like I may be outgrowing this kind of like youthful fantasy.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's something, like there must be something more. And then I started dating somebody slightly older than me. Wow, she was probably 16. And she was into alternative music and alternative movies and got me into all of that stuff, first through the music. And then she had I remember a Laserdisc player, and we got Clockwork Orange out. And that was like, oh, this is how different things can be. That just blew my mind in every way.
Right.
And I could go off on the impact that had on me in terms of like portrayal of violence and like thinking about violence in cinema and why it was like so attractive and repellent at the same time. That could go on for the rest of this episode. But that totally made me go, okay, in the same way that there's alternative music different than the, pop that I was listening to, there is this cinema world out there that I can now dive into. Repo Man followed shortly after that in the theaters. It was like it came out in the theaters. And then there were rep theaters in my hometown of Pittsburgh at that time where I started going to all of the kind of canon of midnight movies, Harold and Maude, all of that kind of stuff. So that was what I was into by the time I went to film school. And then film school is really what indoctrinated me to the, true art side of it.
You went to the University of Pittsburgh, but what was that with the intention to become a filmmaker? And if it was, when did it kind of change to criticism, or was there a sort of realization that there was a different path rather than making the analysis aspect?
I definitely went in wanting to be a filmmaker. At the time, that was not necessarily the school that you went to be a filmmaker. It was known for its film studies program, but there was a local, and God bless it, I wish it was still around, a local film co-op that had been around for a long time and became, I think, the longest running film co-op until it finally died in the late 2000s, like a few years ago, called Pittsburgh Filmmakers. And they taught film classes through all of the colleges in Pittsburgh. So you could take filmmaking classes as well as the film studies classes at Pitt. And it was close to my home. I lived in Pittsburgh already, so it seemed like, well, I'll just do that. And I went there. I took the film studies track because that's how you could get a major, but I really wanted to make movies.
Gotcha.
And it was in the process of making student films that I realized it just isn't for me because it's too technical. Like I wanted what was in my brain to just magically appear on a screen, and it's really hard. Like there are filmmakers that I've spoken to, and I'm sure you've spoken to. I mean, many of them. I think even can't remember who said that it's like building a house or something. like making a film is really like a meticulous process of construction, or can be. I mean, obviously there are people that throw that right out the window, but like there's a certain, it's not like, I've been a writer, you know, I've written screenplays and and short stories, and it's like, you just think of it, put it on the page, but now it's got to happen. And it was like, it's a pain.
Yeah.
And I then later on, when I came to Hollywood to, you know, kind of write for movies, I was getting PA jobs, and just being a PA is miserable existence for me. I'm sure a lot of people like get very excited by it, and then they want to be on film sets all the time. Film sets are like, it's seriously like being on a construction site. It feels like for me. And I honor and admire anybody who is doing it, just not my metabolism. So it was like somewhere in the middle of that, realizing that I'd rather be kind of commenting on and talking to people that make these movies and figuring out how they do their genius than doing it myself.
I often think that film critics have something of the romantic in them, because it's like, you know, once you get into the mechanics of what's behind the camera, you just realize the labor, and also the fact that everybody is just basically solving the latest problem that crops up, rather than, you know, the idea of the sort of auteur vision is really an incredible mythology, I think. So yeah, that chimes a lot. So how did you move across to kind of like radio in terms of the focus of criticism? I know. I mean, we can talk a little bit about the difference maybe between audio and written criticism, but you were in radio pretty quickly in shows like, I mean, you know, reading your biography, I'm going to quote a couple of shows, but maybe you can tell us what they're like, because the UK audience won't have heard of these. So Marketplace, all things considered, Weekend America, and The Savvy Traveller. I mean, I have no idea what any of those are, so maybe you could give us a quick kind of idea about your sort of, you know, move across to radio.
You know, don't feel too bad. Many of those nobody here will have heard of either.
Okay.
Marketplace. So public radio, most, as I understand it, you're going to probably correct me, most of the radio in the UK is public radio, correct? Most of it is.
Well, most of it is the BBC, yeah, which is right. The similar thing, yeah.
So in America, obviously, that's not the case. It's, well, maybe not obviously, but in America, it's not the case. It's mostly commercial, and then there's public radio. There are bands of the dial that are set aside for public radio, and they are. I could get into the whole mechanics of how public radio operates, but it's too ridiculous to get into. But there's certainly a subsect of American population who depends on public radio and is really into public radio, and it's considered in some ways, some would consider it the most boring of all radio. But for those of us who really love it, it's like the lifeline where you get the best news, like the best storytelling and all that stuff. Marketplace was a business show, believe it or not, but my job was to tell the sort of like colorful stories behind economics and business. And it's a show that was built with a certain amount of humor built into it. There's a certain amount of, irony. That show didn't take everything at face value, especially at the time. Mm-hmm. So I was doing kind of like the human interest features behind stuff. I remember doing a feature in the Netherlands about how the Dutch had invented this offspring of golf called boring golf. It was like farmers golf is what that translates to. It was like farmers reusing their land and making this like golf-like game that you literally played through their fields, and like if you hit a cow, you got like a stroke taken off and things like that. And it was starting to make some of these farms more money than their actual farms were making, and therefore it became an economic story. That was the kind of stuff I was doing. How did I get there? How did I get to the point where I'm doing that? Or All Things Considered, actually for All Things Considered, which is a huge public radio show, I was doing music reviews because that's always been an interest of mine too. I didn't actually do that much for them. And then Savvy Traveller was stories about travel. It was like This American Life is the big, well-known American sort of storytelling show where people tell true stories about amazing things that have happened in their lives. Savvy Traveller was like that, except in people traveling. And that was actually the show I wanted to get on when I got into public radio. And I did almost immediately, and then it almost immediately folded. Like it's 7 months of me getting out, which is how I ended up on Marketplace. It was produced by the same people. And how did I end up in radio from film? I came out to AFI, the American Film Institute, to study screenwriting in LA. And after that, I got jobs in television. And this was not in our current moment of platinum era television where there's so much great stuff being done. It was mostly reality TV being done at the time.
Oh, okay.
The best stuff I did was kids animated stuff. That was the most fun. But when I worked on 2 reality shows, and all of a sudden, whereas before I would wait a long time between gigs to get another gig, which is not atypical of screenwriters, suddenly I was getting tons of offers to work in reality because that's where all the work was. And I realized that I could go down that path, and that at the end of it would be a horrible shell of me that hated himself. So I was like, I got to get out of this field. This is nowhere to go. And it was like, I've always done journalism on the side. I've always been a freelance journalist, like sort of writing about film back home in Pittsburgh and about music a lot in Pittsburgh. I was kind of like one of the music guys that wrote for the local paper, and was like, well, maybe I'll just keep doing this journal. I was actually doing a little bit of journalism just for some extra money, freelance. And it was like, well, maybe I'll do that full time. But I like telling stories, and I like kind of the thing about film is that you can bring in music and sound and like all of the effects and all of these different kind of art things and put them together. And it was like, well, maybe I'll do radio because there's a performative aspect of it. When you're on the mic and you're telling a story, and you can use the sound that you're getting and create kind of the cinematic thing in somebody's head. And it's like 10 times easier as well and cheaper to do that than it is to do visuals, which is, by the way, something that Hollywood is discovering about podcasts. It's one of the reasons they're buying up IP from podcasts, a cheap way of testing out their IP. So that's how I sort of got into it. And like the only place that was happening was in public radio. Most of American radio was music, and mostly pop music or country or classical. And so that was like the place to go. There was some of it being done in my town. The Savvy Traveler and Marketplace were produced out of the same offices in downtown LA. I knew some of the people that were involved, so I started doing freelancing, and it just kept going.
It's interesting. I was just thinking about the sort of crossover moment. Well, it's not really a crossover, but the moment when podcasting becomes a thing. And I do quite a bit of research on podcasting as a media. It's one of the areas I've sort of gone into from doing the cinematologists in a way. But I was just wondering, as somebody who's gone into podcasting and now obviously producing the Mubi Podcast, which we'll talk about in a minute, just from that background, that research background for me, it's interesting to ask, when was podcasting sort of become, in your mind, this is something that actually is apart from radio or different from radio? And do you see it in that way, or do you see it as a kind of evolution of radio? Are they separate media to your understanding?
In a way, it's the answer to that is complicated. It's kind of yes and no. So here's the funny thing. I get into podcasting because me and another guy I worked with at Marketplace wanted to have our own show. This is like 2008, before podcasting is really widely being listened to. It's happening for sure. There's already some popular shows, but not many. And we just wanted a radio show, and there was no way, because the public radio world is relatively small, and there's only 24 hours in a day. And by the way, a big chunk of it is taken up by BBC World Service here in the States. People just like buy BBC World Service.
Right, okay.
So it's like there's only so many hours in the day. The weekends had its own, and a lot of those shows happen at the same time every day, all along the weekdays. Then on the weekends, there's separate kind of programming, but there's only so many slots for shows. And who was going to give a couple of radio reporters a show? It's not easy. And a lot of those shows and public radio in the States have been going on forever, ever and ever. There's still shows that have been going on for decades. So it seemed really hard to break into. And it was like, well, we'll just make our show that we had this idea for called the Dinner Party Download as a podcast, because it's the only way to do it. And it'll almost be, by the way, it's almost what I'm talking about. We'll do this as a test, or like basically a proof of concept,
sure,
and show it to our radio overlords, and they'll turn it into a podcast. And amazingly, that's what happened. Like, we did it as a podcast. It's got,
right,
at a time when nobody cared about this, Apple iTunes picked it as one of their top new podcasts of the year. Today, that would be a huge deal. At the time, it was like, oh, that's cool. But it did catch our overlords' eyes, and they were like, oh, well, maybe we'll give you guys a little time in your radio workday to work on this podcast thing that seems to be doing something. And for years we did that, and it couldn't make money. At the time especially, there was nobody wanted to advertise or any of that kind of stuff. So it was like, we have to, if you want to keep doing this, we're going to have to figure out how to make it a radio show. And it was only a 15-minute show. By design, it was a 15-minute show that would be really easy to listen to. The idea was that it was going to talk about all the stuff you'd want to talk about at your dinner party, and you could listen to it on the way to the dinner party and get your hit your fix of culture stuff, and you could be well informed at the dinner party once you got there. That was the shtick.
Okay.
And but to make it a public radio show, we were going to have to make it an hour, because the only half-hour public radio show in America is Marketplace. So we weren't going to sell a half-hour show. We weren't going to sell a 15-minute show. It had to be an hour. So we had to expand it to become a radio show, and then it became a little bit less like a podcast at that point. It wasn't as it was still effervescent. What we did was add a whole bunch of segments. So in a way, it was very podcasty. It was kind of like quick hits and stuff. But the radio show became more popular. The podcast became more popular for a while, but then there were other...
Is this like the early 2010s you're talking about?
Yeah. And then along came all these podcasts that there were like a million movie podcasts. You didn't have to come to our show to get movie stuff. There were a million movie stuff. You didn't have to come to our show to get food stuff. There were a million food podcasts. So anyway, it's interesting, your question, is podcasting? For me, it wasn't. For me, podcasting was a way to do radio, and then our podcast show became more like a radio show. And the moment when I realized that podcasting was its own thing, man. Also, it's hard for me to differentiate that, because a lot of what the best podcasts, in my opinion, are kind of come out of American public radio, and probably British public radio too, in the sense that there was a lot of, This American Life was a blueprint for a lot of the nonfiction storytelling, audio storytelling that is done now, I think. And they also started doing things like doing multiple episodes about the same thing, or This American Life. The Serial is an offshoot of This American Life. There were some of the same people behind This American Life made Serial, and Serial is the moment where podcasting takes off. So for me, there's a big crossover between those two things. I do remember, though, this was interesting, was that I feel like that was podcasting for a while. It was kind of defined by, in certain ways, was defined by public radio, or a certain level of it was defined by public radio. Then there were guys just talking to each other in the basement, which was another thing that I feel like has swept into prominence. And the moment that I realized that was happening was when I went to the podcast movement convention in 2016 or 2015 or something. And there were all of us that had been kind of doing podcasts in public radio since 2008. And a lot of us were up for awards in various categories when they gave out awards. And we actually won that year. But there were a bunch of public radio things that lost to shows that none of us had ever heard of. And we were like, and it was like,
we love these guys.
Yeah, these sports shows. It was like, what? And then, and that's when I realized there's almost a commercial, and just in the same way that public radio is an alternative to the commercial world in the US, there was now a commercial, more popular and populist kind of podcasting going on simultaneously to it. And it was humbling, actually.
It's interesting, because I've just come back from a podcasting / radio conference, and that debate still goes on. And I think it's less about the artifact itself and more about the distribution and the accessibility, because I was arguing that, I'm a film studies guy who's come to podcasting without coming via radio. You know what I mean? So I don't have any of the cues or the interests or the processes in my mind about what radio should be in order to get my podcast out. But so I've learned about it independently and autodidactically in a sense. And it means that I'm not beholden to some of these things that these radio guys think, oh, you must do that to be a sort of a professional audio, production in a way.
Yeah, that's true. And I've had to kind of disabuse myself of some radio things, particularly in public radio. This is still something that I find a little bit hard to shake. You can actually tell me to what extent I've shaken it at all. Is in public radio, there's a big thing about, it's not about you. It's about whatever you're talking about. This American Life changed that in a big way, in that whoever is telling the story is really involved in the story. Very often it's a personal story that they're telling, but I came from the news side of it, and it was all about focus on who you're talking to, focus on the story that you're telling, or the person's story that you're telling, or the news story that you're telling, and take yourself out of it. And I do think that podcasting, it's very clear that message has been received to a lot of the podcast world. that even if you're a reporter who is now, you reported a story on a true crime thing that happened, and now they're turning it into an 8-part true crime podcast, that your involvement with the true crime telling of the story is as important as the story itself. Like,
yeah.
There's this idea that you need to be personally involved.
Sure. I call that, I've just written about that, and I called it the self-reflexive tendency. So that idea that you have a relationship to the subject in the personal sense, so whoever you're interviewing, but also in the broader kind of abstract sense about how is me being here impacting on the story. And I think that's really interesting, I think, in film as well, because it creates a slightly different angle to film criticism, which maybe we can talk about. But it's interesting you say that, because in terms of the Mubi podcast, which I want to come on to talking about now, because I listened to the first episode just the other day, the one on Paul Verhoeven's Turkish Delight, and unlike ours, it comes across as very fully formed. You know, if you go back and listen to our first episode, God, I don't even want to think about it. But, you know, it's completely produced and it has a structure, and, you know, your voice is excellent, and the way that you can read the script to sound like it's not being read is a clear radio technique that you bring to it. And I just wondered, you know, tell us a little bit about getting the Mubi gig and the discussions around what that podcast would be and your sort of central role in the whole production of it, really.
It's all very nice of you to say. I will say that my first podcast, the Dinner Party Download that I mentioned earlier, there were every year when we did a year-end best of episode, it was always this idea of like, let's do something fun. Why don't we go and like rerun our first episode and like have clips from our first episode? Now it's always just like, no one must ever know. It is so like, we sound so bad and so stilted. It's just awful. We're talking too fast. Anyway, nothing's landing. So thanks. I'm glad that it worked, the first episode. I would say, well, first, to the extent that you're interested, you can cut this if you want to, but how I got the gig was I had worked on another similar in the sense that it's storytelling about movies, podcast called Zoom. This was, I always say, came out just before the pandemic, when you could use the word Zoom and it wouldn't immediately mean a Zoom meeting. It could be like the Zoom on a camera. And it was hosted by the great Amy Nicholson, who's now a critic for the New York Times and was at the time Variety. She's also on the podcast Unspooled and the film podcast. And it was basically like a historical, it was for Focus Features. And the idea was that it was every time Focus had a movie out that they wanted us to do an episode about, we would take the genre that the film was in and we'd do kind of like the history of the genre, where it came from. And which is fascinating and fun to put together. We didn't do a ton of them, but among the people who heard it was a friend of our composer, the guy who did the music for it, Sam Clements over at Picture House, and a great guy. And he knew, I think that he then met at a party one of the people from Mubi, and they were saying, we want to do a podcast and we don't want it to be a typical like chat show podcast about movies.
Gotcha.
We want it to be like a film history podcast. And there aren't, weirdly, that many of them. There aren't that many movie storytelling shows. There's tons of people talking about movies, but there's not that many people doing kind of documentary style thing. So I had unwittingly put myself in the position of like having a rare talent or rare ability or something, or rare resume. And so we talked, and over the course of a few months decided to push forward. I'd had this idea that first, every season of the Mubi Podcast, for those who don't know, is about a different topic. It takes a different way into talking about movies. And that first season was about movies that were huge in one country and not well known anywhere outside of that country. And I'd come to that idea I had that idea to do that through music, because I'd been in the Netherlands and this guy who's a huge music hero in the Netherlands had died, and I had no idea who this guy was, but the country was in mourning like Kurt Cobain had died. And I had that idea that this would be amazing to do with movies. So I pitched that idea to them and they went with it. And I don't know, I think maybe, why did it come across so fully formed? There's probably two reasons. One is that between the end of Dinner Party Download, which was much more of a film, it was like a arts and culture magazine show where it was like two guys who were happy-go-lucky, me and my co-creator of the show, my co-host on the show. We're like two guys going through the world of culture and eating food and meeting people and like learning interesting things about culture that you can share at a dinner party that was like had more of that vibe. I went from that to doing a lot of, after that show ended, working for companies like Crooked Media and Wondery,
Right.
were really about narrative storytelling.
Yeah.
And I'd done narrative storytelling because I was a writer, but I hadn't done a ton of it recently in my audio work. And so I like learned from those guys idea of how to do a cold open, like trying to grab the audience right away with like some sort of scene that kind of captures the imagination. And I've been doing a lot of these kind of things. I worked on several of these, like miniseries, sort of narrative miniseries. So I kind of had a structure in my head from having worked with those guys before, and I just kind of used that structure and those styles to tell this story. And also that I'm a huge fan of the Netherlands, and the first episode is about Paul Verhoeven's Turkish Delight. And so not only was I talking about movies, which was super cool to tell the story of this crazy movie, I was talking about a city that it was shot in Amsterdam, which is a city that I love, that I'm very familiar with, and I know the history of it. I was just like super excited to tell that story. So that really helps with it.
The Netherlands, my favorite country. Home to more bikes than people. A modest land of small homes where people drink beer out of small glasses. But also a country where in 1973, a quarter of the population went crazy for a film that sounded like this. How does that work? I'm Rico Gagliano, and on June 3rd, the curated streaming service Mubi, the best place to catch beautiful and often mind-blowing movies from across the planet, invites you to join me for the Mubi Podcast, a front-row seat to the great stories behind great movies. This first season, it's a trip around the world as I dive into films that were monster hits in one country and nowhere else. We'll make stops in India, Brazil, Nigeria, and we're starting, yes, in the Netherlands with the Dutch classic Turkish Delight, a crazy erotic melodrama made in a very different time.
Complete freedom. I didn't put on a bathrobe between takes.
In a country going through some very big changes.
From Town Hall, the carriage goes to West Church, and smoke bombs explode along the route.
And a movie that blew millions of Dutch minds.
We were stunned when the movie came out. I mean, over like 4 months, 5 months, the lines were still around the block. That had never happened before in Holland.
It's a crash course on another culture through the lens of a film that broke all the rules, featuring the voices of the people who made it.
Anyhow, my name is Paul Verhoeven, and I'm the director of a Dutch film called Turkish Delight.
The premiere of the Mubi Podcast, your audio atlas to a world of great cinema. Follow us on Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.
It really does feel like, when you're listening, a kind of cinematic travelogue. I mean, you even introduce yourself at the beginning as an arts and travel reporter rather than a film critic. And you definitely get the sense of wanting to evoke a sense of place. And I think that comes through all of the seasons as well, through voice, narration, sound design, as you've said. And again, I think it relates to this idea of maybe it's a genre that needs naming, something like narrative film criticism. And I wonder, is that sort of sense of having an experience for the listener, an intention to set them in a place? Because we often, when we do our live shows, for example, I'm really interested in that idea that the audience or the listener feels like that they actually were in the audience and can hear the sort of ambiance of what's going on. So the post-film Q&A has a sort of texture to it that you can sort of identify or feel yourself involved with, even though you're just listening on your earphones.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in that first season, because it is like a travelogue, it was designed, like every episode is about a different movie from a different country, and it is about like setting up what that country is like, for sure. But I do think it's kind of like the main thing is it's storytelling. I think in every story, that when you're telling a story, you want to kind of set a time and a place and the hero or heroes within that place, and that you're going to follow through and there's going to be an arc. I just think that that's important. I'll also say though that I do think that public radio, like, it's kind of a good thing to have been a reporter, particularly the kind of reporting I was doing where it was features. It wasn't like I was doing news spots where it's like, here's why India just bought 20 tons of gold or something for why that's important to the markets. But often it was trying to tell, a feature. Very often I was an international reporter, so it was like setting pretty quickly for an audience, like, where are we and why does it matter, and using sound to do that. And that's always just been important to me. And part of it, maybe it's also coming from a cinematic background where it's like, I want to create little movies. I'm not the first person to say this. I think it might have been, can't remember who said it, but like, radios are the best movies there are because you're
you create it in your head. Yeah,
exactly. For each person, there's like you're bringing you're helping somebody basically create a movie in their mind. So maybe that's why that is important to me and why it's just a natural part of it. And it does always bother me when there's too much. Like, there are podcasts out there that are very well respected and are actually really good in their own way, but it's like a person talking and telling you the story without anything except maybe music. And that can totally work and be very effective. But to me, I want as many bells and whistles as I can. Like, if I can get actual sound from the place that we're talking about, that's fantastic. If I can get sound effects of things going up, just like anything to make it a rich audio experience.
It's interesting that you said about there that, the way that Mubi, they had an interest in having a podcast, putting a podcast together that wasn't just talking to directors, although there is a bit of that in your show. You do episodes in that way. But I just wondered if you think about the number of, say, companies that are not, say, media broadcasters to start with, whether it be like cinema chains, they've all got a podcast now, and some are half decent, some are just recorded Q&As and stuff like that. They don't put a lot of effort in. I just wondered what does Mubi see as the role of the podcast in relationship to its wider interest in, its commercial interest, but also its sense of its own brand, you know what I mean?
It's an incredibly rare company in the sense that they really have, even though they're a for-profit company, they're not a non-profit company. I do feel like it's bizarrely mission-driven. And the mission is just to it's pretty simple. It makes it actually difficult in some ways because it's like a broad and very simple, but it's just to elevate great movies of any kind. Like, if it's just a really brilliant piece of filmmaking, it's just like anything to elevate that and to elevate movie going and to make people and to, sort of celebrate and help people who love movies see more great movies, that especially ones they might not otherwise see or that deserve championing. And it's like, to that end, they are interested. I mean, the first thing that was fascinating was that they, very specifically, this also goes for Mubi's magazine, is that it's not just about promoting movies that are on Mubi. They just, in fact, like the season that we're preparing right now, I'm almost a little worried about, there's not a single movie that is available on Mubi. And we actually got some flack for the first season of the podcast because we're doing these deep dives into movies that can be hard to find. So,
sure.
Not Turkish Delight, but others. People were like, I want to watch this now, and I can't see it on Mubi. And we're like, that's because we're about any great cinema. So that is one thing. But why they didn't just want to do, I think the other thing is that everything Mubi does has to be kind of like, I know that I'm sounding like a brand ambassador, right? But
that's fine.
I've worked for a lot of brands and a lot of places, and I am pretty amazed constantly at the fact that this exists. But they're about doing the best work. There was a point where it was kind of like, what's the shtick of our show? Is there a shtick? Maybe we should only ever talk about every season the topic of our show changes. And it was like, we could just keep doing, there's a lot of countries in the world. We could do every single country. What's the movie that's huge in that country and not well known outside of it? And it was kind of like, yeah, but there's so much more to explore and there's so much more stuff to do. Let's do, it's basically, they want to do anything that's interesting and anything that's excellent. It was really like, we don't want a shtick.
Yeah.
We want the shtick to be that it's great. if there is a thing that unites all the things in movie world, it is that it is all excellent. Like the website should look really good, and the posters should look clean and beautiful, and the movies we promote should be awesome, and the magazine should be like it's not just like, you know, a stapled magazine. It has to be like perfect bound and have like great graphic design and everything in it. It's just like they want something that is more than just like sounds like we put effort into it and is like awesome. And it's not easy. I can tell you that making you probably know this from, you know, maybe having done it yourself, but it's like making a podcast at all is not easy, and making like a documentary style podcast is tricky.
Oh no, without a doubt. I mean, interestingly, I've done 2 or 3 episodes that are kind of akin to audio documentary in that way. We did one on psychiatry recently, but we have no budget and we have no creative production behind it, so it's just me and Neil, and that's what stops us really from being able to do that. And also, I mean, it's interesting because I think that there is a kinship, I think, between the cinematologists and the Mubi podcast, but you're kind of more on the journalistic side of that, and we're more on the academic side of that, if you would sort of to compare them. But I think it's interesting, maybe I feel sometimes that our growth is handicapped by, well, the fact that we're not stars and we haven't got big brand names attached is one thing, but also we've been very clear about editorial and creative control. You know what I mean? Any time anybody comes and says, "Oh, you know, we're just worried," we just want to do exactly what you said, which is we want to make decisions and make the best thing for its own sake. So it's, you know, there's definitely a similarity there. But I just wondered about your sort of, you know, you can be as diplomatic as you want in this answer, but I just wondered where is the sort of dynamics of your editorial and creative control over the show?
No, I mean, we have a bunch of people from within the company that are all super podcast fans as well as giant movie fans who sort of chime in on the show when I'd say the most editorial confabbing is in coming up with what the season will be and what the movies will be that we cover. But once we're going, it's like I'm given a surprising, I'm not given total, I would say, editorial control, which actually would suck.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure there.
It's not just that, it's also like it is surprising as somebody who really does like to be left alone to do their creative work. It is also surprising if you're left totally alone to do your creative work. You're like, wait a minute, does this suck?
Yeah.
You're like, this may be terrible, especially after you've lived with it for a really long time. You're like, I think maybe all of this is awful.
Yeah, know the feeling.
And you really need somebody to go like, okay, this part is awful and this part isn't. You're all right. So there are definitely people who like are constantly involved on a weekly basis and like checking in and saying like, how's the process going, and listening to stuff and commenting on it and all that kind of stuff. But I would say that I'm given a surprising amount of editorial control, mainly because I feel like it's a company that weirdly works. This is going to sound so self-aggrandizing, and I don't put myself in the same company as the people I'm going to be
right,
you know, hinting at. But it's like, it's a company that is about raising the work of auteurs, right? You know, great filmmakers and working with great filmmakers and finding the
singular visions.
Exactly. That's the point. That's exactly right. Maybe not even filmmakers that anyone's heard of, but if they've got a singular vision, that is like the movie thing. And I think that works too, that it's like it's interesting when we'll talk about a topic for a season and it'll be like, well, this is the topic that kind of might be the one that is like most jiving with whatever movie's doing at that time, or that the, you know, world is talking about or something. But there's always a question of, well, Rico, are you interested in that? Like, do you want? They know that on some level, if I'm like, I could do it, I'll be a worker bee, but like, if I'm not interested, it just won't be as awesome on some level. And I would do it because but they're really, it's surprisingly cool about that it's like they want me. And there are definitely episodes where I'm kind of like, I'm pitching you this episode. It may not be the one that you guys want to do so much, but I really wanted to do it. And there's at least one episode per season where it's like, it's there because that's the one I was just really jazzed about, you know.
But I really got the sense that you were enjoying the whole season during the Needle Drop series. And as I was listening, I kind of realized that, like, you're quite similar to Neil, I think, in terms of having film and music almost symbiotically related to each other in your cultural identity. You know, I hope that, I mean, you can sort of confirm that or reject that, but it's, it seemed to really come through the themes that you wanted to draw out in the needle drop season. So did that sort of fulfill a lot of that desire to talk about film and music together, in a really in-depth way?
Oh man, I would say that about all of the seasons, by the way. I do feel really, I mean, like, it wasn't my idea. The second season was about movie theaters, for instance, and that wasn't my idea. That came from within one of the other people on our team, but it was like, once it was brought up, it was a more difficult one to do because it's harder to do a thing about movie theaters in a non-visual sense, I think, in some ways. Like, you think about, you're going to do. But it was like that. I feel so. I worked at a movie theater. I worked in actually a faded movie palace in Pittsburgh at a time when nobody was going to that movie palace at all, when I was in high school and in college. And just have massive memories from it and felt so strongly about it. And it was like, we have to do that season now that you brought it up, because like I can imagine just like it matters so, like movie theaters matter so freaking much to me. And so it's true of all of the seasons. And the first season was like, I am a travel writer and I love travel. And it was like, this is a way, this was also made during COVID. So it was like a way to travel during COVID in our minds anyway. But definitely that season, there were, and especially certain episodes, like the Scala episode in that season, I played for friends and they were like, you basically were born to make this episode. And by the way, I had not heard of Scala until we did that season.
That's just around the corner from where I live, the Scala, which is where it was such a great episode. I absolutely loved it.
I'm glad. Thank you so much. But in the Needle Drops episode, for sure, that was what was the one in there, like the Donnie Darko episode.
Yeah.
That is because it's hitting on so many things. The early 2000s were a really special time to me, and the era that it was set in was this, the late 1980s is a special time for me. The band Tears for Fears is an incredibly special band for me.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not alone. This was complete coincidence, I will say. This is not why we chose this editorial direction, but after we had chosen that as a topic, talking about movies and needle drops in movies, we did a survey of Mubi subscribers, and the people who responded anyway, they were listing other things they were interested other than movies. And number one was, I don't think I'm alone in this. I feel like a lot of movie people are also into music. And especially when we talk about pure cinema, I think about moments of pure cinema, and a lot of them are just images and music.
Yeah, music and sound driven. Yeah.
It's a great way to move things forward without dialogue. Yeah.
In terms of the themes, do you have a quite a clear sense of, if you're talking about the Scala episode, or you're talking about any of the Needle Drop episodes, is there a sense in advance that you know what the theme is, but yet with all of the great interviews that you get, it seems like it must push you in different directions, and then there's got to be adaptations all the time. So it must be I'm just thinking the way I edit, at times I find the direction in the edit rather than having that prescribed beforehand,
Absolutely. Yeah, I do not work with an outline. And sometimes I have like a vague outline in my head, but I don't work with an outline because I find that you're absolutely right. As soon as you start interviewing people, it all goes out the window. And you can even interview somebody and go, okay, now I know what the story is about. You'll get off the line after having interviewed someone, and they'll have given you this beautiful arc of a story. And you're like, oh, okay, this led to this, and then this happened, and then the movie was made, and then it came out, and this happened, and it was great. Perfect. This is a wonderful narrative. And then you interview the next guy, and they're like, that's all bullshit. That's not how it happened at all.
Yeah.
You've got to either choose one, or you're going to have to redux it in some way that takes both of those points of view into account. It's like you absolutely can't know totally in advance. But I do think that it's important to go in thinking that you have one, because it just shapes how you interview people. Like Wondery has this very, very difficult process when you're a writer for how they do prepare a miniseries. And the idea is that you, without doing too much research, write an outline of like the way you wish the story plays out. They're like, okay, that's how I think a great story. Now go research it and see if that's really how it happened. Then you go and research it. You're like, okay, this is more how it happened. And then they sign off on that. And then it's like you start doing your interviews, and then they say, okay, now rewrite the outline. based on the interviews you've done. So you're constantly having to do that. And I basically do that, but at a much more compressed space of time and don't have to write it out each time.
And it's also great, isn't it, getting the reaction? Because there's certain times I was listening where you seemed genuinely kind of shocked and surprised at what you'd heard. And that fed into the interest of listening. So, for example, the musicologist on episode 1 about 2001, he was sort of really bringing out kind of new ideas that you were sort of reacting to in a fascinating way. And then Neil wanted me to mention the Folk Implosion Kids score from Randall Poster, because he's been listening to that apparently a lot recently. So yeah, it's great when these sort of little nuggets come out of the interviewees, and then you're able to kind of riff on that and move forward. I think it's a testament, I think, that to sort of interviewing well, that then you can then weave that into a narrative as a whole,
Oh, absolutely. And that's what you're 100% looking for. The worst is when you're interviewing somebody and they say nothing that you haven't heard before.
Right. Yeah.
You're always trying to get them to say something that you've haven't heard before. There's still I think there's still some value in telling stories that, like, say a filmmaker has told before, because the chances are most people haven't heard it. Fans like you and me will, for certain filmmakers, we've heard everything they've ever done, whatever. But it's still like, I'm always like digging for something that'll make me go, really? Because if I'm going, really? That's what happened? Or that's something that spectacular, ridiculous happened, then the audience is going to think that too.
One of the issues that I find a lot with podcasting now, and I think it's maybe in the last 2 or 3 years when it's become more almost completely fully commercialized, is that it used to be that there was a space there where people would say things that they wouldn't ordinarily say. I think that's what Mark Maron has sort of dined out on a lot, and these intimate interviews where they'll say something that they've never said anything else anywhere else. And I think that a lot of film podcasts have gone down the road of being, just sort of celebrities slapping each other. I mean, I don't know whether you like the kind of round table, you've got 2 directors or 2 actors sort of saying, oh, you're great, no, you're great, no, you're great kind of thing. Or whether it becomes another strand of PR, because I think one of the things that podcasting did was just make us realize how crap the sort of press junket interview circuit is. And I don't know whether it's kind of lost that a little bit, where podcasting now has just become, again, feeding a sort of PR cinema industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. By the way, I should note, even though we've talked on and on about, how I love making these documentary style episodes, we do in between each season, a regular season of the show, we have these bonus episodes where we do just interview filmmakers about their latest film. And it's definitely 2 people in a room talking. But even there, I agree with you. The whole idea is to try to, it's always been like, even in my old radio show, The Dinner Party Download, the idea was to knock people off their talking.
Yeah.
And by the way, it doesn't even necessarily have to be like, this is what I hope that more celebrities would get into, is that it's not about gotcha journalism either. It's just that I want you to, I actually care about artists, and I usually care very much about the art that I'm helping them popularize. There is like an uneasy detente, I guess, between like me as an interviewer and the person who is promoting their film. I do know that on some level that we're a promotional arm, that we're helping them promote the film. But at least on my show, we're not talking to them unless I'm really either into them as an artist or into their movie, and very often both. And I want it to come across as best as it can. Like, I'm not in the business. I've never wanted to make the kind of show where it's about like, this is maybe one of the reasons why I'm not a film critic, is because I maybe don't have the cojones for saying often to a filmmaker I actually otherwise admire, yeah, you know what, your thing sucked. It's important. I love film critics, and I think what they're doing is 100% important. And the best ones don't just say it sucked. They say, here's what's going on. Here's how it relates to the world, why it's not working in the world that we're living in. All sorts of different things that they're taking into account. But I don't have the constitution for it. And I'm really in the like, this is awesome. Everybody, like, let's get into it business. And one of the ways you do that is by appearing like a human being. You know what I mean? Not just somebody who's like reading a script. And there are times when like you can hear it in people's voices. I'm not sure, and I'm sure they don't even realize it, where it's just like they're saying the same thing that they've said 1,000 times. And it makes somebody, I feel anyway, I would be less inclined to take them as seriously as an artist and to take their movie seriously. If A, all they're doing is reiterating talking points, or B, is, to your point, just kind of going, you're right. Every time I see any movie behind the scenes thing, it's like working with X was a dream. And it's like, it wasn't always, maybe it was, but it wasn't always a dream. And you will seem more like an interesting person who's doing something of value that takes effort if you tell me about the difficulties and challenges that it took to do, you know? That's where I agree with you. It starts to become rote and almost pointless. It's kind of like when you see some of these, you know, things on, I don't even know who's producing them. Like my mail is through Yahoo. So I often end up clicking on things on the Yahoo front page that I otherwise wouldn't. And it's like, oh, somebody did some little clip about some movie that came out, and it's just, you know, a clip of somebody on the red carpet saying something rather insipid or like not that particularly interesting on a red carpet, because what the hell else are you going to say to somebody on the red carpet? It's rare that you're going to say anything that interesting. It's like, why is anybody even bothering watching this? Why do you care? There's nothing being gained from hearing them do 5 seconds that they've said to 10,000 other people. So yes, I do think that there's a version of that that's maybe happening more in podcasting. It's a little bit different though, don't you think, in the sense that there is the understanding, I think, in podcasting more than maybe other mediums, that you're at least supposed to joke around. You know, like you're supposed to, it's almost like you're listening to the interview, not so much for a new insight as to hear the person just as if you're at a party with them. And that's new, and that's different than what we had before. But I'm not sure that I'm getting as much out of it.
Yeah, but I think that to me, I think that level of authenticity was kind of original, maybe around the sort of 2016 to sort of 21, 22. I mean, again, I don't want to sort of say, you know, this just doesn't happen anymore. But I just think that now podcasts are so, people know what they are, and there's almost a sort of performed authenticity at times where, you know, just listening to certain shows, I just felt, you know, people talking, oh wow, they've really got something there. And maybe it was something to do maybe with the idea of the podcast space being some sort of new environment that people could, you know, get in touch with another person, and people were searching for that kind of realism, I think.
Yeah, I would say, like, I still think this is true in podcasting, and maybe true in everything increasingly, is that like authenticity is the coin of the realm. That's really what people are into. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why companies like Mubi and like it to a, you know, bigger commercial extent, probably A24, are like huge, is because like there's this feeling that they're not doing anything that they don't want to be doing passionately, you know what I mean? And that the filmmakers are doing something that it's like you said, a singular vision or whatever. But in terms of what we're talking about, it's if anything starts to feel like it's programmatical or de rigueur, then by definition, it's not authentic feeling anymore. Maybe it is authentic, but at least it's not authentic feeling. And it's something to worry about. And I do worry that the kind of podcasting is getting tarred. This is a kind of a much huger conversation about podcasting that I wonder if people in the cinematologist audience are totally interested in.
Oh, they'll listen. Don't worry about that.
I love, God bless them. Maybe I'm straying away from the initial topic a little bit, but I worry, I'll be honest, I worry more about, and this, by the way, you're hearing, this is somebody who's kind of fascinated by some of these conversations, by the way, but I'm more worried about the Joe Rogans of the world, in a way, in the sense that there is an idea now that is all podcasting is. And it's not like, and I'm not going to write off Joe Rogan entirely. There are definitely many episodes of his show. I don't listen to it religiously or anything, but I'll come across excerpts of it on YouTube. And occasionally it's kind of like, that guy's actually not that bad an interviewer, you know? But then, of course, there are other times when I'm like, this guy is actively hurting the world. But regardless, just the idea of like mainly bros talking about mainly male-centric and a certain kind of male-centric bro stuff for endless amount of hours and thinking that they really know a lot about it and not necessarily knowing a lot is like how all of podcasting is being tarred. And there's space for it. There's space for everything in any medium. But it's like the example I've been using is if you look at the New York Times, anytime they have an article about podcasting and you look at the comments section, the comments from people who should be the prime audience for a lot of really well done podcasts in the world, including some by the New York Times itself, there will be people that are just like, podcasting's ridiculous. I do myself a favor by not listening to it. There's no need to it. Sounds like it's a bunch of people who think they know a lot, don't know anything, and who cares? Good riddance. If it's an article about how the podcasting industry is like not getting as much advertising dollars, it's like good riddance. Who cares? As though podcasting is a genre and not a form of media. You know what I mean? And it's almost, I worry about it for the podcasting industry at large, because there is really fine work being done and, you know, conversations that are, I think, fascinating and are not like the conversations you're getting anywhere else. And I worry those are getting like buried in a tidal wave of much easier to produce other stuff. You know, do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think it's difficult from my perspective because this is a side. It's not a side hustle, but it's a project that aligns with my day job, which is just, you know, managing a big university course. So I don't worry about things like audience or advertising or money. It is just basically a labor of love that me and Neil do, and we've managed to carve out a little bit of a tiny space for ourselves in terms of, you know, we haven't got a huge audience, but we've got a kind of level of respectability, I think, particularly in the UK and within sort of like academic journalistic circles. So what frustrates really is the fact that we don't have the time to put as much into the expansion of the podcast as we maybe could, and we don't have the time to really polish to the extent that we would like to. So, but we've reconciled the fact that we're in a certain space, and it's actually the doing of it that we enjoy as much as the kind of outcome. Like, oh, we've got 3,000 listeners or whatever it might be. We've got to be kind of into the I mean, it sounds pretentious, but the artistry of making it, or the process of making it, like having this conversation is the thing for us, and the release and who listens to it is kind of the secondary thing.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, there's also no question that it's like commercialization changes things. Once people find that there's money to be made in anything, it ends up changing things in terms of more people getting involved in it and other stuff, and therefore and the money being put into that stuff and lifting it up and all that. It's complicated. It's also very strange to me because like I was there, not right at the beginning. I'm not like a pioneer of it or anything like that, but very early on, and knowing a lot of people in the space and all of them having a similarly to you kind of like at base, it's like there is something important that we want to do here that is more than just fun or, you know, whatever. There was a seriousness of intent, whether it was a serious artifact or not that came out of it. You know, it could be a very silly comedy thing or something, but there was like there was a certain amount of kind of similarity of thought about what everybody was trying to do. And then like watching it become an industry has been crazy. It's kind of like, if we're talking about movies here, it's like, I imagine what it must have been like to be the guys in Hollywood, you know, with a barn that they rotated to get sun to come through in the right way. And they knew every other person with a barn, you know, between the Edisons and everything in the world. And then suddenly there's like a huge industry springing up around it, and movie palaces being made and all of this kind of stuff. It must have been simultaneously exciting and potentially lucrative for some of them, but also like, what's going on here? Like, what are you doing? It's been fascinating, and it's like, there's definitely the good and the bad, and we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of strain.
Well, listen, you know, as a purveyor of audio cinematic creativity, you definitely are up there. Very influential to me, particularly in terms of the way that you make your show. And I think that
thanks.
There is something interesting and very important about the audio space and the way it kind of covers cinema. It's doing something that written criticism, I don't think, does do.
What do you think is the difference?
Well, I think that there's a sense in which the best podcasting is actually working through ideas rather than trying to finalize an answer to whether something is good or bad, or whether there is a kind of way of understanding film culture that we should all be party to. I mean, again, this happens on podcasts as well. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I think that in the written word, or the culture of written film criticism, it's funny because there was a lot of argument about this online on social media about, at one point, I think it was last year, where people were saying that everybody knows that journalistic reviewing, they're writing from a subjective position. It's implied in the reviewing, right? But I think a lot of writers write as if what they're saying is gospel. Do you get what I mean? So it's almost as if they're writing with a tone of, not with, I think this is my opinion, I'm reviewing this, and getting to know me as a reviewer will reveal my kind of tastes, and you're either on board with that or not. That was the sort of blueprint of, newspaper and magazine columnists back in the day. But I think more and more, because we're very ideologically polarized, writers have to set out their stall about, I am this kind, and this is my politics, and this influences what I think about this film, right? Whereas I think with podcasting, because it's the voice and you can't get around, if you disagree with somebody, you on a podcast, it's really hard to say, I disagree with you, therefore you're a bad person, everything you stand for is shit, and I hope you die because you don't like the same film as me, right? You've got to come at it with more of an open mind, because for some reason the podcast space opens up that level of open-mindedness in its best sense, not all the time. So that's where I see
yeah. If it's a conversation, it's kind of like you can leave it with, well, we've kind of got back. It's a debate. It's not one person giving their thing. If it's a conversation, and if in the case of the main seasons of a show like mine, it's more of a documentary that's kind of like, here's what this person says, and here's what this other person says, and here's kind of a general story that about this film and where it kind of fits culturally into the world, and here's kind of what that might mean. But there's a lot to think about, isn't there? Like maybe the takeaway in a lot of the takeaway in podcasting, and maybe in audio in general, is there's a lot to think about, isn't there? A lot to unpack, huh? Rather than here's something definitive. That's interesting. I had not.
But it's interesting how you do listen to certain writers who are on podcasts, and some of them come with that kind of open mind, and other ones definitely don't. And the way that they come across in the podcast is, well, I kind of understand that you have a different opinion to me, but I'm right. It's the tone of the way that they talk, and like definitely, Neil and I have set our stall out of that idea that you respect what the other person is saying, and you actually take the time to try and engage with why they've got to that opinion, because the process of getting to an opinion obviously then informs the opinion. So that sense of I'm right, you're wrong implies, well, I'm not even going to outline why I've got to this opinion, because it's just ideologically pure for me, and I find that kind of problematic, I think.
Yeah, there's no discussion. It's really interesting, and I wonder because it's funny if we're sitting here saying that maybe there's something inherent in podcasting that allows like a little more of an open-ended resolution at the end, or lack thereof, is I guess what we're saying. It's funny because I think that the popular idea is that it's a bunch of people sitting around exactly like you're talking about, that have already formed ideas that are super hard and are actually just like transmitting it out into the world and not having any kind of like in-depth conversation about it. Or rather than they're having in-depth conversations, but they already know what their what the end result is going to be.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Endless conversations about something that they all 100% agree on.
They've decided already, for sure. Well, listen, Rico, thanks so much for all this time. It's been really great, and like I say, I really appreciate the show, and I look forward to continuing listening, obviously. And it's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, ditto. I love having these kind of conversations, and thank you so much for having me and for doing what you do.
This is called The Artifact and Living, one of 16 Andrews instrumentals laced through Donnie Darko. Simple and heartbreaking. And to fill the end credits, he imagined a full song, lyrics and all, in the same vein. So one night, he sat down at the piano and, just to get the vibe, started replaying this piece.
That was me with Rico Gagliano. I think you'll agree, cinematologists, regulars, that, that was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it. So much to sort of think about. And just to say thanks to Rico for taking the time out and giving us all of that great tape. Neil, what did you make of that chat?
So much. I think it was a really rich conversation. Like you sort of said before, cinema, criticism, podcasting. I think that it was just a really kind of heartwarming, I suppose. Just to hear such thoughtfulness about the form of film podcasting and to get a real sense of how someone has come to it from really interesting trajectory. It was a really enjoyable conversation. One of the things I thought was really interesting, and this is something we will probably talk about more on our bonus episode. We're going to sort of record a bonus straight after this, which kind of talks about film education and film students and just the kind of the state of play with sort of young people studying film. And I thought it was really interesting that when you were talking about his time at university, which I think echoes our own, he was talking about how it was a kind of explosion moment, that he'd been kind of developing a cinephilia, and it comes from an interest and a curiosity and a fandom, as so much of it does, and then it gets piqued by these sort of entry point films, and we all have those. And he was talking about Repo Man, which was nice because that was our first ever episode. But then how the moment of university was this moment of kind of opening the eyes to what cinema can be in a kind of really, really broad sense. And then I thought it was really interesting that the conversation ended when he was talking about film podcasting. And he said this great phrase, that it can often be sort of endless conversations where people are 100% set on what they already know, which I thought was a great phrase. But that also made me think about where we are in kind of film education, where it feels like that shift has not just happened in podcasting, but is reflective of where a lot of, unfortunately, sort of young people come to university with a very different reasoning and approach to it. And it's hard to have those moments where you're kind of opening doors for them into what cinema is in a kind of really exciting way. So I thought it was kind of telling that the conversation arced that way, given, I guess, the arc of our time in film education as students and then educators. And I always find it interesting when there's resonances between education, the film industry, and podcasting. So I thought that was just something I wanted to note, and I didn't know if you had any thoughts on any of those bits, Dario, before I go on to some other bits of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get into this quite a bit, as you say, on the bonus. I mean, it was interesting because I was at a conference in Sunderland on radio and podcasting, and without sort of besmirching anyone kind of directly, I was sort of aware that set idea of what a certain medium is was very prevalent in certain people who were there and giving presentations. And then at the end of the conference, I sort of, as Neil, is my one, I like to spark a conversation and see where it goes. I did that, and there was quite a lot of pushback on the idea, that podcasting is doing anything different from radio, and the idea that there are ways of thinking about media and its use that aren't covered in academia and aren't defined by academia, you know what I mean? That actually, the way that say, for example, young people or anyone really use media may be in ways that people in academia have never thought about, let alone put into practice. You can't. It's really problematic to me to then say, well, it's up to us then to educate them into the right way of doing something. And it's the same. It's a very similar principle in terms of saying, as we say as Rico and I talked about, that idea of, I'm writing this criticism, and the reviewers reserving the right to say, well, it's implicit that this is all subjective, but the tone of the writing is often, this is how it is. This is the truth of this film, you know what I mean? Or the truth of how you should understand this film.
Yeah. And a lot of it, again, speaks to what we've talked about a lot, which is that the idea of an aesthetics and an ideology, and maybe a more tension-filled relationship between those two things in the past as opposed to now. And I mean that in a kind of productive tension sense, form and content, than we might be seeing at the moment, I think. And it's evident in a lot of cinema, which we talked about, where it feels like there's a very didactic and a very, almost asterisked approach to things, so that there's no space for any kind of tension within it, which should lead to conversation. I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting what you're saying there about the film criticism. And I loved your phrase, actually, the kind of the idea of a narrative film criticism, which seemed to really pinpoint, I hope we're doing sometimes, but certainly what the Mubi Podcast is doing, and thinking about it in terms of like Paul Cobley's definition of narrative, in terms of the way something is done. It's not just that it's a story.
Sorry, I was also thinking of that in terms of the book Brian.
Yeah.
There's a sort of narrative film criticism in the written form as well. I think that idea of sort of storyfying criticism is a really interesting way to think about what certain work is going across different media.
Yeah, lovely example. Yeah, and just different ways of approaching it, which are not as simple as kind of saying it's all subjective, and I think that you pulled out where Rico's interest and excitement and passion lies, but it's never at the expense of, kind of rigor, research. And I thought it was really interesting to hear about how a lot of the editorial and creative discussion happens at the start of the season, and that kind of that mapping out of the territory of a season, I thought was really interesting. As someone who likes to see podcasting as an act of curation, sort of contemporary curation practice, that felt very close to that, where it's like, okay, where are we going to go? What are we going to cover? How are we going to do it? And then that's let go of as the kind of the creative process of kind of putting that into motion sort of takes over. So that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and I really liked as well what he said about Mubi and the sort of brand of Mubi and how it ties into the podcast in a way that's not prescriptive, and in a way that's kind of like, we're interested in certain things, but we're not necessarily using this as a sort of branded tie-in. It's its own thing. It's an associated piece of creativity. And I think that's really, I mean, in an ideal world, I'd love to have that. If we had more time and more budget, it would be great to have that sort of associative type of production, in a way where there's people doing things that maybe even, we wouldn't be involved with, but they're under a cinematologist banner, but it's kind of something apart from that. And they don't necessarily have to tie in for commercial reasons or anything like that. And I just think that's where a lot of non-media based podcasting kind of falls down. It's like, if you've got chains or you've got businesses that are creating podcasts, it's all about, how is this another revenue stream? And it's nice that, I mean, he must think, I mean, I didn't say it outright to Rico, but he must think, all his Christmases have come at once, that he's got the backing of the company. But yeah, there seems to be that level of creative autonomy for him.
Yeah, and I was definitely one of those annoyed people in season 1 who was like, why can't I see these films? Because the podcast was so good. But yeah, it was really refreshing to hear about that kind of approach, which to me is kind of one of the things that does make Mubi stand out as a kind of real kind of transmedia sort of creative company. Where the Notebook online, the Notebook print, the podcast, and the streaming service are all doing something different. It's all connected, and I thought Rico articulated how Mubi see it as connected in terms of the filmmaker voices that they want to engage with and promote, and that runs through the films. And even this is something I wanted to sort of move on to, the idea of singular vision, because I think even looking at the season 2 in the cinemas, that a lot of cinemas are often run, particularly kind of cult rep cinemas, are run or founded in their kind of halcyon days by film lovers with a singular vision, Scala being a kind of a sort of key British example. And then that led me on to really loving that conversation around the idea of an auteurist podcasting, not from a kind of like grand individualist perspective, but from that very idea, like you say, where filmmaking is a collaborative enterprise with a singular vision at the helm for coherence as much as anything else. And seeing this side of podcasting in that way, there are a lot of people who contribute to the Mubi podcast, and it is Rico's vision, but it's clear that the development of that podcast and those series and the delivery is a collaborative exercise, which for me is kind of auteurism at its best. And I just thought it was really interesting to start to think of podcasting as, okay, what if we think of it as a space for auteurs? Because I think what it does is it shows us, like in film, good auteurism and bad auteurism, in terms of those kind of egos that you talk about so much in the episode.
Yeah, it's just refreshing as well to sort of keep thinking about podcasting as a space where there is, a lot of great creative stuff going on. Because I think that, in the circles, the sort of research circles that I'm in with regards to podcasting, you hear a lot about, it's all now incorporated, it's gone back to a broadcast tradition in terms of structure a lot of the ways. Now loads of people are getting laid off in podcasting. And I kind of said this at the conference, and I think I mentioned it to Rico as well. It's like, it sounds terrible to say this, but that doesn't matter to us. You know what I mean? It's like podcasting for us is not about how many people at Wondery have got a job or wherever, you know what I mean? And again, and that's not to sort of not feel sorry for somebody who's lost a job. And when people lose jobs, it's terrible. But there's a different way of thinking about podcasting, I think, that goes back to before it became an industry. And that's, I think, still where you find really interesting conversations and interesting work, in the production side too.
And Rico made that point himself, in terms of the comments around podcasting, often seeing it as a genre rather than as a form, seeing it as this kind of monolithic thing with the kind of the Joe Rogan-ness of it all kind of covering everything else like ash. But the reality is that, but formally, there is so much stuff that's possible. And as we have discovered, and as you sort of mentioned, like audiences gravitate towards those things, and an audience is not something that I think is judged on numbers, and we don't judge it on numbers. It's judged on the quality, and I don't mean that just in terms of interaction and support and the conversation and the feeling that you're doing something. Because you were right about the process of it. For us, it's all about the process, really. But there is that kind of part of it where that sense that people are listening, that there is a kind of a critical fraternity out there, I think has really helped our podcast, because it's having that kind of focus of, well, our audience is there, and we want to honor that. We want to kind of, we want to make sure that we are being as kind of thoughtful and as innovative and as interesting as we can be, given all of our situations. And I think that's one of the nice things about Mubi as a company, if companies can be nice in a capitalist sense, but you know what I mean, is that they do seem to pay attention to that aspect of it, and they do seem to understand that the people who gravitate towards the films that they show and the things that they read are a particular type of audience, and they're cognizant of that. They're not apathetic, and they're not dismissive of it.
No, I think that's a great place to finish there, Neil. Thanks so much for engaging so thoroughly and curiously with the conversation. That was great. Yeah, let's continue this on the bonus, shall we?
Sounds great. Yeah, really great conversation. And yeah, thanks to Rico for coming on the show. So yeah, we're going to head over to the bonus, and we'll be back with another episode at some point in the very near future. But for now, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.